everyone. Hi. Welcome to the next session. This is all about how to actually productionize AI and ML in the public sector. Hopefully you didn't get too turned off everything around AI with the last session and horror stories or the fears. We'll talk about maybe how it's working or if it is or where we're going. I've got two great people on this session with me. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Phil, do you want to go first?
Typically just had a mouthful of water.
Why not?
Hi everybody, I'm Phil Simpson. I'm Head of Software Engineering at Transport for Greater Manchester. I've only been with the organisation 5 minutes, it seems, June actually. So most of my career has been in the private sector, so public sector has come with some interesting challenges.
And John?
Afternoon everyone, so John Burt, I'm Head of Enterprise Architecture at Manchester City Council, so I'm not very far away either. I've been there about 18 months now. Before that I had a role with the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which works alongside the 10 local authorities and transport and police, etc. And then before that I was at Salford Council for 20 years, so I've not moved very far in the last quarter of a decade.
We've got a lifer. I think it's pretty hard right now to find a company who doesn't have some kind of plan in place for AI and ML, but whether they're getting very far with these, we don't know. So could you tell us a little bit about where you're both at with the AI journey at the moment? Tell us a little bit about kind of what use case you're using, how you're finding it so far. Phil, I know you're newer to Transport for Greater Manchester, but where are you guys at?
Very early in the stage. There is a growing recognition that we need to do something. I certainly have my ideas. One thing that I have found that's very useful, there's an ISO standard called 27001, which I recommend to anybody. It's definitely worth a look. A lot of structure around that. But being such a heavily process-driven organisation, it is really important that you have something like that to fall back on and guide.
Yeah, so, similar sort of journey. There was actually something at DTX Manchester somebody said that I've used a number of times, and everybody is obviously talking around AI at the moment because of generative AI. It's obviously not new, the algorithms have been around for a long time. But he stole it from somebody else, so yeah, you're allowed to use that. But he says it's very much like teenagers and sex. It's generative AI at the moment. They're all talking about it. Very few are doing it, and those that are doing it probably aren't doing it very well. And I think that's a fair comment around where it is, because it's only 2 years old, but it's a technology built. As a technology that has been released, it's the first one that you can put right in the hands of users and they can utilise it because it is that natural language. And we're seeing that, and that brings its own challenges. But we're really looking at, we get asked the question, what can AI do for me? I've no idea. It's a technology. What's the problem you're trying to solve? What's your biggest pain points? Where's your low-tech, no-tech solutions? What's a lot of manual processes? And it's picking some of those up. So we started with some simple ones like potholes. Everyone loves potholes when you talk about the council, don't we? So can we use AI to automatically detect the severity of that pothole? So we're doing that as a proof of concept. We're using things like Copilot M365 as well in certain areas. So it's really just looking at, can we find use cases that we can develop on and build on top of platforms and start delivering that back to the organisation, rather than just saying we're rolling out AI, because it's not something you can do. It's a tool to solve a problem.
Mm-hmm. And how are you kind of like weighing things up? Because I think everyone talks a lot about needing to have a really good problem statement, not just focus on the solutions at hand. But how are you actually then measuring it up of, okay, we've got this money, we can do this? How are you picking like what to use? Are you like bringing service users into it? Are you trying to get to the coal face of people? Like, what's that process look like of evaluating?
A number of different ways. So a lot of it's been through conversations. We have strategic business partners that work back the organisation and bring some of those problem statements in. We've picked some simple ones where we're not making data-driven decisions using AI against adult social care, because that would not be where you would start with these things. So the pothole one, we have a knowledge base in SharePoint for housing services that they use to interact when they get calls in. So we've started developing a model around that. Even simpler things like getting people to utilise things like Copilot Chat instead of Google, just to find things easier. I got it to draw me a new Teams backdrop, which had the skyline of Manchester on, which looks really, really cool. Everyone's commented on. And it's using things like that that then starts to get people to think around the problems that they face every day and the potential. So you're moving the conversation away from the technology again.
And I think that's key, because there is a lot of fear, as we mentioned before. And if we can ease people into this, then we've got much greater chance of success. If we think of it as a change project, then those little quick wins can make all the difference and actually build that confidence in the solutions that we're providing. So as an example, one of the things we've just looked at just recently is we have surveys that come in from people's transport from their journeys. Well, it was a very laborious, slow process. Well, all we were looking for were keywords and sentiment, and they come out of the box with AWS, AI. I'm not familiar with GCP where our AI is concerned, but it's trivial, it's fractions of a penny, and it just works.
Yeah, I think it's easy to think about the big transformational change, like the massive impact, but actually some of the smaller things can do a lot of good and can probably be rolled out a lot quicker.
Oh, 100%. I always use the analogy, it's similar to automation, isn't it? If we can save people's time, and again, that helps with that proof of value, then if I can save you 5 minutes a day, over a year I've saved you roughly a week's worth of effort, and those 5 and 10 minutes very, very quickly add up.
Love that. And so John, we talked a little bit about cultural change with both of you there. You've been in the public sector quite a long time, so I imagine you've had to figure out how to make change happen in the public sector, which I'm sure is so easy. Are there any tips you could share for people who might maybe not find it as easy as you?
Yeah, well, we were talking about this earlier, weren't we, when we were catching up, and it's, there is a lot of governance inside public sector, and that's right in many ways, because obviously we're spending your money, and it's, we've got to get the most out of that money to deliver the services, which is, we can't sit in local government and not talk about austerity and all the challenges with that, but it is really, really challenging. It's been 15 years now of the amount of money available to us in real terms is significantly gone down, and the organisations have shrunk. So, fundamentally, it is getting easier to get things done because there's less hoops to go through, because there's less people around. I think the main thing we did at Manchester, and this was something we did at the combined authority as well, is we stopped talking about the technology and started talking about platforms. So my target architecture that I presented, we talked about an integration platform. In there, we've got a number of different technologies. We can add more around automation, RPA if we need to, etc. We've got a data analytics platform. We've got a low-code platform. And that's the way that you kind of change the conversation back with the organisation away from being around, if I said, well, we've got MuleSoft in the integration platform, what can that do for me? Don't know. What processes have you got? What's your challenges? So it just changes the conversation straight away from the technology to the outcomes, and that's the key thing. And then back within ICT, at Manchester, it is a very, very traditional internal IT function, feeding and watering servers and so on. And what we've done recently is we've established what we call a digital enablement function. A lot of people call them Centre of Excellence, but it's a bit too elitism for me, that. That is a dedicated new function that's kind of got service designers in there. It's going to work in an agile way. It's going to use those platforms to move very quickly in an agile way to deliver those outcomes, and true kind of DevOps language, but you're doing it with low code, so it's a lot more iterative. You can work with them, you can play back to them very, very quickly. And then the other thing that we talk about as well is if you look at disruption in the industry, you get your likes of your Ubers, your Airbnbs coming in and disrupting a market. That's not going to happen in public sector. No one's going to create Manchester 2.0, are they? So, how do we disrupt ourselves? How do we talk around doing things differently and in different ways and adopt different practices rather than that traditional kind of procurement plus waterfall approach? So, we're right at the beginning of that journey, but we've got to, because the whole way that we consume services changes.
But we need to focus on value as well, though, don't we? Because ultimately that's what we're here to provide, and that's no different public sector or private sector. Unless you're working in a software company, we aren't a software company, of course. But what you have to recognise, and I'm sure most of the people, if not all the people in this room recognise this, every organisation's a technology organisation these days. And I've only been here 5 minutes at TFGM, but it does feel very much that there are people who've been there all their careers, worked their way from the bottom to the top. They know the industry inside out, could tell you, in my case, they could tell you anything about transportation, but they don't have that recognition that we do have to adopt and embrace technology, because if we don't, then we aren't providing the best value to our end users or customers, or in our case, passengers, pedestrians. So having that focus on value does then mean that we have to show them, because they're not technology people. You could talk about it, but you can see the eyes glaze over, it goes over the top of the head. They need to see it, and we need to find ways of actually doing these little experiments and these small quick wins and showing them the value that's there, because then that light switch switches on, and then you get that virtuous cycle. But you have to start. You can't almost, I don't know whether you agree with this or not, but I feel very much like I'm going to have to ask for permission, not ask for permission, but ask for forgiveness a lot, and actually show and say, look, this is what we could be doing, because there's so much value in IT. We aren't a cost centre. We should be a partner, and that's no different in the public sector than it is to the private sector. And I'll get off my soapbox now, so apologies.
No, stay right on it. When you are thinking about that kind of fail-fast mentality, which I think a lot of people will follow in the private sector, and you get a lot more judgment to follow in the public sector because you have a lot more responsibility, how do you find that middle ground? Like, how do you actually get people to kind of get on board with it and iterate? Is it just a case that you have to steamroll a bit ahead and you do that ask for forgiveness process? John's nodding so intensely, I'm just going to assume that's a yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's part of the utilising platforms enables you to do that. So part of the challenge is with the governance is obviously the initial spend on something. And we use a waterfall approach to put some of these platforms in place. And that's what goes through the governance. But that then gives you the capability to work in an agile way, because it's just people time then. So that might be the new digital enablement function that we've created, or we've bolstered that with a third party as well, and they're working in an agile way as well. So effectively then you only really talk about people's time rather than actually going out and asking for more money. And that's really helped, because we can try things and we can experiment, and then we can fail fast and change direction and pivot. And the fact that we're doing it in sprints, then you're only ever 2 weeks from of wasted effort potentially if you head down that route. So that mentality has been difficult to bring into Manchester in particular, because it is a big team for a local government, and they're all working remote now, so it's really difficult to excite them, engage them. They've not been particularly well thought of historically. There's been a lot of churn of particularly CIOs there in the past. There's been a lot of stability problems. That's all resolved now. So now we can become that digital advisor back to the organisation and start to solve problems with them. But that transition away from buying technology to using technology to create solutions is how we're starting to instill that into Manchester.
One of the things you mentioned when we chatted before was culture and culture change, and this is a cultural thing. And culture change is hard. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not easy. But the best way of making that cultural change is to do it iteratively, to start small and introduce different things for people to try it. If it works, brilliant, keep it. If it doesn't, throw it away. Again, back to that fail fast. My favourite book on DevOps is a book called Accelerate. If you haven't read it, read it. Brilliant. But one of the things they say in that is the best way to change culture is to change the way people do, the way people work and what they do. And that's it. It's to encourage and to, actually live the values that you want the team to follow. And actually by doing that, again, it builds. But again, I keep repeating myself, you have to start.
Yeah. And it's about empowering people as well, and giving them trust and letting them work on their own and develop and then come back to you. And that kind of change doesn't happen overnight. I got this target architecture slide deck that I've done a number of different conferences, but used it predominantly internally. And it's 50 odd slides, which I go through at lightning pace because it's all about the narrative, not the content. There's only actually 2 slides in there that is actually anything to do with architecture. The rest of them are about cultural change, about what's happening in the industry, you know, quoting people that I've learnt from. There's quotes in there from, Henry Ford around, learning with the, if I ask people what they want, they say faster horses. So what does that mean for us? And that's about, asking people what the problem is they're trying to solve, not just what solution do they want. And it's using things like that from outside that's got potentially nothing to do with technology to instill that different thinking, and that's really challenging in local government and wider public sector because, as Phil said, there's people been there all the working career in similar roles, and that's all they've known.
Yeah, it does imagine it's a hard one to navigate, and I think with so much of AI now being relatively accessible, I mean, you've mentioned once your parents knew it, you were like, wow, everything has changed. But does that then come with the danger as well of everyone adopting their own kind of initiative of, I'll take this on, I'll start using this, I'll start putting data here, I'll start, inputting things there. How do you kind of control that risk factor? And you've got so much more governance and need to be careful about bias being introduced into the public sector. So how are you navigating that balance of wanting to empower everyone to be innovators and to fail fast, and the risk of failure if they go rogue?
It is difficult, and it is a balance. It is about, one, reminding people of the responsibilities, play safe, but a lot of it also comes down to education. If you, it's the kid in the sweet shop analogy, people can go mad and go crazy, and you end up with a whole load of shadow IT if you're not careful. But by building those communities of practice, what was the term you used? I can't remember.
Well, it's ecosystem and digital enablement.
But putting the guardrails in place, having that proper governance in place up front in advance as much as possible. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to stifle innovation. You don't want to stifle those ideas and that creativity. So again, it comes down to culture, about that no blame culture. And I don't know what you think, John.
I think it's not a new problem, is it? No. That shadow IT has been there for a while. And it's about, you mentioned it's exactly right, guardrails and getting those in place, reminding people, that we have corporate tools for a reason for these things, and that's why we don't use ChatGPT, because the corporate tools don't add it into LLM, whereas obviously there's that risk with ChatGPT and other AI platforms. About education and guiding people on this journey and reminding them, that this is data, and if you put it into something outside the corporate estate, you're effectively potentially releasing that data for use. I think we're doing something at the moment. When I joined Manchester, there was a guy in HR that was developing a lot of Power Apps, citizen development. And colleagues were like, we need to stop him. I was like, why do we need to stop him? Well, he might do something wrong, he might expose something. No, what we need to do is get the guardrails in place so that he can develop those. And then when they get to a business critical app, and this is literally what we're doing at the moment, is we can move it into a different zone of support for us to take over that app. Now it's become business critical, and he's developed them. And it's about encouraging and developing that ecosystem inside, because it's going to be even easier with AI for people to be able to create their own capabilities to solve their own needs. So we just need to make sure that that they're supported. We foster that, get people together virtually that they've got similar interests that can develop stuff. So it's about being supportive, and something Gartner's talk about, particularly for an enterprise architecture, which I'm slightly interested in. But where EA is going as a function, traditionally enterprise architects have predominantly actually just been technical or solution architects. They haven't actually been enterprise architects. There's very few. And where they need to be is to become that, Gartner say internal management consultant, I say digital advisor. because management consultants in public sector aren't a great conversation topic. But yeah, it's about, you know, advising and supporting and enabling them to do it in a safe way.
Love that. And is it from the culture piece that you've been able to have people be transparent about what they're working on, so you can have those different zones? Or like, has that come over time, or do you think that other people could implement that if they kind of open the doors? Like, is it a case you open the gates and then you have to like kind of pull people right into the pen with you, or are people kind of coming to you with their ideas, like they're coming forward and wanting to engage with you when it comes to AI?
There's no one size fits all. It's a really interesting but difficult question to answer, because, you know, every organisation's different, every department. It's more about being pragmatic, you know, using common sense. Again, it's back to that same point of having those guardrails in place, but actually guiding. There's a lot of hype around AI more generally, and a lack of realism as to what we can do with AI. Now, yes, the future, the potential is huge, but at the end of the day, these are still tools. They still do need that human guidance, that human usage, and it's not magic. But obviously there are risks. You have to have your eyes wide open and be very conscious, because we mentioned before about the bias. Now, you can the model that you build, you can do everything to avoid that bias, but ultimately the people who are going to be using it still have that subconscious bias. So you have to have that cognition that when you're working with these models, to always think about how you build your prompts so that you don't bring bias into that. Sorry, I've gone off on a massive tangent there.
Love a tangent.
Yeah, I mean, it could, well, you know, Phil's absolutely right. It comes in from all different manner of routes into the organisation. You know, obviously with most people being remote, you don't kind of get those water cooler conversations anymore. But it'll be something in a meeting, it'll be a chat, you know, or it'll be through a more formal route that we've always had. And, you know, it's just a case of getting into the detail. And it's quite often off the back of other projects that we're doing that you'll get, you know, yes, we're doing this project here, but we've got this problem over here, and, you know, all of this comes in and we have to key it into the system manually, and then, you know, we always get errors and stuff like that. Is a more straightforward way of doing it, and it just becomes a conversation really to talk through the problem that they're trying to solve. And I think that's the real interesting thing. You know, as an industry, you know, we were talking before, well, you know, Phil mentioned before around, you know, every organisation is now a digital organisation. If you'd asked a local authority whether it was a digital organisation pre-pandemic, they'd have been no. It was the pandemic that really made people realise how much they rely on technology, and obviously that has grown exponentially since the pandemic. You know, and that was a key changing point for me in people's realisation of how much technology was actually embedded into the organisation. I mean, we've got our audit team going around and talking to the business now, saying, you know, in the event of a significant cyber incident, you know, what would you do if you didn't have technology for 2 weeks? And they were like, oh, it's not going to be there. No. You know, and there's the examples of that. There's more obvious examples in the public sector because, you know, we declare everything of local authorities that have been offline for weeks. You know, there's some areas of the NHS that haven't recovered from an incident 2 years ago. Yeah, you know, so there's that reliance on it that, you know, really trying to have that conversation with people to be realistic about these things. But then going back to, you know, what's the underlying thing that we're trying to solve here?
Amazing. We've got time for some Q&A. So are there any early questions, or do you want me to give you time to think? We've got one right here. Mimi's just bringing a mic for you. I love someone who's prepared.
Thank you, Noob, and thank you for giving all those insights into the public sector. My question actually is around around your thoughts around the sustainability in this scenario, around the green software thing, and meeting the the council goal of carbon neutrality by 2038. What is it that you're going to be doing or looking at by introducing this AI/ML? Are there any other practices that you're looking at?
I always love that question. And it's not the first time I've had it. And you're absolutely right. 2038, it's not that far away. And that's just not in Manchester. That's the whole of the region. So Andy Burnham set that out of one of his mayoral pledges. It's there in the industry, isn't it? At the moment it's 2% come from data centres. That's forecast to go to 8%. Which the airline industry is only 2%, so, and that's obviously going to be fueled by the more use of Gen AI. For me, it's how do we use that technology to reduce the carbon footprint in other areas? How do we then use the technology to reduce how much AI consumes as well? I always flippantly say as well that all of the big hyperscaler data centres are in the south anyway, so it's not really a problem for us. We're actually moving the problem out of Manchester, which I know is not probably the most political right thing to say approach, but I haven't got the answers, to be perfectly honest, but it is, we have a group within ICT that's looking at sustainability in ways that we can contribute to the overall organisation and region strategy to hit those targets. Obviously, transport is a huge part of that offset.
I mean, the company I was at before coming to Transport for Greater Manchester was actually creating green hydro fuel sources. It's fascinating stuff. If anybody wants to talk about it afterwards, I'm more than happy to.
Any more questions? Go on, Danny, and then we'll do it.
It come back to, you mentioned bias before, and obviously there's personal bias, but there's also bias in the data you're feeding through the AI. How are you preparing your team and everyone using AI to understand that what they're using isn't necessarily the truth? There's a bias in that.
Yeah, a lot of that comes down to education, because with all the best will in the world, you're never ever going to get 100% away from it. So you have to have that. I mean, I mentioned it before. You have to have that cognition that this is a real thing. And so again, when I talk about education, it can be things like prompt engineering. How do you build your prompt? But it isn't just AI. There's, I do a lot of recruitment. 5 minutes. And for example, when we build, and generative AI is really good for this, by the way, but when you build a job spec, you have to be careful of the language that you use, because depending on how you write your job spec, it can come across as very male-friendly, and obviously we want that diversity amongst our workforce, particularly in IT, more traditionally. So it's about education, it's about knowledge, it's about encouraging and sharing. It's not about beating people over the head with, the you know what I mean.
Fear stick.
Fear stick.
Yeah, and just building on that, I mean, obviously, that's one of the reasons we're picking use cases that aren't data-driven decision-making based off AI, exactly because of that. The ethics side of it is absolutely huge, and probably a complete area in itself for one of these events. But looking forward, when we're working in local government, the people that we service, yes, it's the entire population of the area, but most people that consume our services, it's schools, it's bins, it's that basic level of service that everybody gets. It's those that actually cost us the most amount of money, which are then also the ones that would be biased against in many ways because of the situations they're in. If you look at our budget, for Manchester, it's about 70% is spent on adults and children's services, and that doesn't include schools. So there's a huge amount there, and it's always the place that always is over budget. In some councils in the region, I know it's up towards late 80% of it is spent on children's and families. I know that's where AI is not going to make decisions. That's where humans make decisions, but we can still make things easier for those practitioners.
But the other thing is you're constantly training your models as well, and if you have that transparency of how it comes to its conclusions, then you can use that to better train your model.
Amazing. Final question?
I'm curious if you've had the opportunity to actually like deploy into production any tools that leverage AI, and what kind of lessons learned and what benefits that brought?
Great question.
Are we talking now public sector or previously?
Anything.
Yeah, in a couple of, so I used to work for a law firm. We won a dozen industry awards in a year from some application that automated a very manual process. Now, one of the challenges that we had was that we came in one Monday morning and it stopped working. And the reason was Microsoft behind the scenes had changed their model. So we had to, it was pretty easy to put right. We just had to retrain the model. I think the key is to get started. Don't expect to have the perfect solution up front. You know, perfection is the enemy of getting stuff done. It's, you know, get started, iterate. That would be my advice. And then Johnson Matthey, the company that I talked about just before, we had a problem with £200 million worth of uncategorized purchase orders. Now, we used OpenAI. We spent 3 days and we got over 90% categorized. And it was very much almost like a hackathon, really, just working with some brain bots from Microsoft, and it worked really well. And yeah, the savings could be anywhere up to 40 to 60%, talking to the head of procurement. Now, I've since left the organisation, so I couldn't tell you how much they've sent, but any percentage of that figure of money is serious business, and you'd be shocked how easy it was. Shocking, really good.
Early days for us, you know, we're obviously using things like Copilot in the organisation. It's pre-built. We've got 2 projects in development already around AI, but very early days in those. And that's more because setting ourselves up to be the development function. We didn't have one before. So this new digital enablement function is going to be our dev house. Before that, we had to rely on third parties to do anything for us. So it's been more around getting the guardrails in and getting our own capabilities so we can start to pick those smaller pieces of work up.
Amazing. I hope that's been useful for everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this session. If we can give them a round of applause.